All right, everyone, as Venezuela slowly swirls into economic irrelevance, it's time once again for a standalone video declaring that democratic socialism is BS, because I keep seeing from people like socialism apologists. They'll say one of several things when you confront them on Venezuela. Either it's not real socialism, it's a coup, or, basically US out, Maduro was legitimately elected. And I think to myself, this actually undercuts like the nouveau socialism light of Bernie Sanders or AOC and people like that, when they're like, well, no. It's socialism, but we're democratic socialists. We're the basically it's like taking Stalin and putting a smiley face on him. It's basically what it boils down to. I think unmedicated individuals studying the basic rudiments of economics would understand that socialism is bullshit. There's a reason. It's sort of like when you're in college, if you go to any English course, you'll have to read The Great Gatsby and or The Sound and the Fury. These are two of my least favorite books of all time, and bear with the metaphor here. The two of the shittiest books ever. Great Gatsby, it's fucking boring. Sound and the Fury, it's fucking boring. It's basically literary dadaism when you think about it. It doesn't really mean anything. It hasn't. The idea that The Great Gatsby is even well written, I think, is laughable, and the movie adaptation was even worse. It's like Romeo and Juliet. All the movie adaptations, for the most part, suck ass. Initial play is pretty good, but it's overrated. Get some fucking Caliban up in there, then you get the Tempest, then you understand the real Shakespeare. Get some farcical materials. It's way better than, oh my god, we love each other. Oh, now we're dead. Too bad. But everyone pretends when you're in college. All your English teachers will pretend The Great Gatsby's so great. Your high school teachers, too. Because it's really more of a high school level book in a literary sense. The Sound and the Fury, it's like, oh, what a glorious American classic. It's a masterpiece. Really, though, it sucks dick. That's really what it boils down to. They're not well written, especially The Sound and the Fury. It was basically, wasn't that his the author's idea? Faulkner or whoever the fuck wrote it, I don't even know, I don't even remember or care, to tell the truth. Wasn't it just basically a reaction to Hemingway, I believe? Like, he was like, well, this dude writes weird shit, it doesn't mean anything, and then he said, okay, I'm going to write a book that's literally like that. And because people are stupid, they took it seriously, and they search for deeper meanings in it, even though it has none. And so it's basically a joke at every high schooler's expense at this point. Marxism and socialism are the same thing. You go to, your political science class, or any other class in college in certain places, and they're like, oh, Marx this, socialism that, like fucking even infects anthropology. Like, they still refer to Marx as being important within the context of anthropology because he wrote some anthropological theories early on before anthropology technically existed at all of which have been completely discredited. And yet I still had to read several chapters on how important Marx was, despite the fact that his armchair anthropology was disproven a century ago. So it makes no sense. Oh, primitive communism existed, and people were so much... Basically, it was nothing more than the golden age utopianism of the era reflected into economic leftism. It's basically what it boils down to. But people still pretend that he's great and has something to say that didn't kill 100 million people. So it's bullshit. But democratic socialism is even more BS than socialism at large. Socialism is an insane and absurd ideology. It will never work. It can't be implemented properly most of the time. When it is, it collapses, like in Venezuela. And if it exists at all in a more stable form, it's propped up by hypercapitalism, like you see in Scandinavia. That's the truth of the matter. But now, socialists have realized if they just put the label democratic before it, it makes Americans feel more positively towards it. If they say that socialism means free shit, then people overwhelmingly support it. Yeah, people love free shit. Now try telling them it's not actually free. It's basically just redistributionism. It's an element of communism, and the Reds are actually here. Now people don't support it quite as much when they realize what it's really about. So right now, socialists are busy rebranding themselves, trying to disown Venezuela, but then the more hardline socialists think that they're sellouts and actually say, no, Venezuela's socialistic, it's just undergoing a coup. That's their next line. It's like when Bernie Sanders had pro-Venezuela bullshit on his campaign website, which I think might still very well be there, and then has to come out and explain it. Oh, I like Chavez, he was a good guy. Socialism back when the economy was working. In other words, back when oil prices were very high so they could borrow endlessly. Does that sound familiar to any economic situations anywhere else in the world? Like, oh, I don't know, the U.S. with our debt. What's our national debt at, by the way? We're a real capitalistic country with trillions of dollars in debt now, aren't we? hyper-regulation. Every penny is taxed 5 or 6 times by the time it goes into the government coffers. It's basically used up its usefulness entirely. You know, a debt-based society in which a great many people don't really actually contribute anything into the collective pot because they're incapable of it because of government interventionism keeping their wages low. Hyper-capitalistic. Capitalism is responsible for our problems. No, capitalism is the only reason that we still exist fundamentally as a power. If it weren't for the elements of capitalism we do have, our economy would be flatlined just like Venezuela's. If we had adopted their kind of methodology, our debt would be 5 or 6 times as great and we'd be hyperinflating right now, so keep that in mind. Central planning is always a bad thing. And that's partially what it boils down to. In order to enact a socialist state, if you were going to enact a socialist state, you would have to keep the bureaucracy as limited as possible. The problem is that in order to enact a socialist state, you need centralization. And centralization tends to expand bureaucracy and expand government power. This is also why left-wing ideologies tend to become more authoritarian more quickly, whereas far-right ideologies, which are more constrained at least on the economic side, tend not to. Only when they become moralistic, usually in a religious sense, do they become more authoritarian. Otherwise, you're basically dealing with something like monarchism. You're dealing with a variant of libertarianism inherently, because the government, if it is very laissez-faire economically, it fails to ever enact a power structure capable of abusing people too much. But leftism requires that power structure by default, because it's the only way that it can disperse wealth, redistribute it. It's the only way that it can keep the haves from revolting against the government itself by being parasitized by people who produce less, in other words. That's basically the problem of socialism. It literally can't function. No, it doesn't get properly implemented because it's a non-working ideology. It's an ideology that inherently fails as soon as it's implemented because it inevitably becomes too authoritarian and too top-heavy. There's no other way for it to work. The only other way would be to have an anarcho-syndicalist sort of situation or something like that where people have formed their own collectives and they're engaging in some degree of market economics between themselves to increase efficiency. That's basically the only left-wing ideology that could work. The problem is they will inherently have trade squabbles. They will inherently have internal issues. They will inherently develop those power structures on a less centralized level, destroying themselves one by one in the process. That's what will happen with that sort of system, too. Name for me a far-left system that has ever remained stable for very long. You can't, because it can't. That's about all. Peace out.